In the years leading to 70 AD, Jerusalem stood at the edge of destruction. The Roman legions, under the command of General Titus, had encircled the city. But as they prepared for the final assault, within the walls of the holy city, another war raged. A war not between the Jews and the Romans, but among the Jews themselves. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Mark 13, verse 12. The Zealots, those Judeans who had sworn to fight Roman rule at all costs, were bitterly divided. Each faction believed they alone carried the true vision of Jewish resistance. Instead of uniting against the enemy outside their gates, they turned their swords one against the other, spilling blood in the very streets they had vowed to defend. As the historian Josephus lamented, they trampled upon all the laws of man and laughed at the laws of God. And as for the oracles of the prophets, they ridiculed them as the tricks of jugglers. The Jewish War 4-6-3. Eleazar ben Shimon, a radical zealot leader, commanded the temple itself, turning the Sacred Heart of Jerusalem into a fortress. He and his men saw themselves as the last true defenders of Jewish independence, refusing to submit to any form of compromise. John of Giscala, another powerful figure, controlled the outer courts and much of the lower city. A master of deception, he played both sides when it suited him, offering negotiations while secretly plotting his rival's downfall. His forces, often made up of cutthroats and opportunists, terrorized the local people as much as they did the Romans. Shimon bar Giora, a warlord in his own right, ruled the upper city with an iron fist. His army was the largest and most disciplined, and he saw himself as the rightful ruler of Judea. He was a man of ruthless ambition, and between him and John there could be no peace. As these factions tore at each other, another deadly force lurked in the shadows: the Sicarii, the dagger men. Fanatics even among the zealots, they struck from the darkness, assassinating anyone they deemed a traitor, Roman sympathizer, or even a rival zealot leader. Their presence added another layer of fear to a city already drowning in chaos. Josephus describes their brutality. They imitated every wicked work, nor was there any sort of wickedness that was esteemed a work of courage by them. The Jewish War 5-1-4. But beyond these factional battles, another sinister force took hold. In times of despair, people seek hope, and in Jerusalem, that hope took the form of false prophets and self-proclaimed messiahs. Some were charlatans, preying on desperation. Others may have truly believed they were chosen by God to lead the people to victory. Either way, they led their followers to ruin. Jesus had said, "Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." Matthew 24 verse 11. One of the most infamous of these figures was known as the Egyptian, or Ha-Mitzri. Years before, he had risen in the Judean wilderness, claiming to be a prophet sent by God to overthrow Rome. He led thousands to the Mount of Olives, declaring that the walls of Jerusalem would fall before him, just as they had before Joshua at Jericho. But instead of divine deliverance, he found only slaughter. Felix, the Roman governor, sent his legions, cutting down his followers and scattering his movement. The Egyptian himself vanished into the desert, but his legend persisted. Even in the siege of 70 AD, whispers of his return echoed through the streets, and some still believed he would come to save them. As food grew scarce and the siege tightened, more false prophets arose. They claimed to receive divine visions, promising that God would strike down the Romans if only the people had faith. They led men, women, and children into the streets, urging them to stand unarmed before the enemy. And the Romans, without hesitation, cut them down. Josephus describes their tragic fate. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation that God commanded them to get upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. The Jewish War 6:5-2. As Jesus had said, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Matthew 24 verse 24. With every passing day, starvation and fear turned former allies into bitter enemies. Mothers watched their children with hollow eyes, while fathers wept over empty tables. Jesus had prophesied, "They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Luke 21 verse 24. The once great city, the city of David and Solomon, became a battlefield of its own making. The enemy was not just outside the walls, it was within them. In their madness, the warring factions turned to desperate measures. Rather than allow their rivals to gain the upper hand, zealot factions deliberately set fire to the city's food supplies, thinking to deny sustenance to their enemies. But in doing so, they doomed the entire population. Starvation swept through the city like a plague. Josephus records this self-inflicted devastation. While their internal wars continually preyed upon themselves, the famine also consumed them, insomuch that they left the dead bodies in heaps, and their own hands set fire to their granaries. The Jewish War 5:1-4. Thus it was fulfilled that was said by Jesus, "There will be famines and pestilence in various places." Luke 21 verse 11. And all the while Titus and his legions stood waiting. The Romans had no need to rush. They watched, they listened, and they let the Jewish factions destroy themselves. The temple stood, its golden facade gleaming even as the city burned around it. But not for long. The hour of judgment was near, and soon the greatest symbol of the Jewish people, would fall in fire and blood. The end of their world was coming,